One of the other strains running through the young William Blake's nonconformity was Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a term that we use to describe a plethora of heterogeneous spiritual movements in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, located mainly in Rome and Alexandria. These various movements shared in their suspicion of the authority of the first 5 books of the Bible, in particular in the authority of the book of Genesis, even more particularly in the idea that the Judeo-Christian God is the only God, is a good God, and a just God. These various Gnostic sects ultimately thought that the God of the Bible is either flawed or perhaps outright evil. How could these Gnostics reach this conclusion? They looked around at the world and said, man, this world is pretty terrible. There's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of injustice, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of violence. We are born, that really hurts. We go through life struggling against insecurity and depression, that really hurts. And then we grow old and die, that really hurts. Would an all-good, all-just God create such a terrible world? The Gnostics said no. Now, this basic assumption led to all sorts of different rewritings of the book of Genesis. The primary shift in Gnosticism away from traditional Judaism and Christianity, though, lies in the word. Gnostic comes from gnosis, which roughly translates to knowledge. Not knowledge as in something you would learn theoretically, like physics, but knowledge as in intimacy, acquaintance. I know my wife. And the idea is that one gains salvation not through faith, through believing in a set of doctrines that are connected to a deity, but one gains salvation through a spark of insight, of revelation, or an epiphany. One finally realizes that this world is not a manifestation of a perfect God, but in fact this world is a flawed creation of a flawed God. Blake would not have read Gnostic texts proper. These were not really discovered until 1945, when an Egyptian peasant near an area called Nag Hammadi actually found in a cave several vases of scrolls. And it turns out these scrolls were several texts, a lot of them called Gospels, connecting to these Gnostic traditions. So suddenly, biblical scholars and people all around the world thought, wow, in addition to the 4 Gospels that made the so-called Bible, look at all these other Gospels that didn't make it. There's a Gospel according to Thomas. There's a Gospel according to Philip. So many Gospels. But also there are these strange prose poems like The Thunder Perfect Mind. Fascinating. You can go out and buy these right now. They're in a collection called the Nag Hammadi Gospels. Blake could not have had access to this. But Blake would have known about some of the early church fathers, like Irenaeus and Hippolytus, who wrote attacks against the Gnostics, and in doing so described a lot of the basic Gnostic views. Blake also would have been aware of some 18th century thinkers like Pierre Bayle in his Encyclopedia, who described various Gnostic movements. And Blake also would have been aware of thinkers throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance who were informed by basic Gnostic ideas, such as Paracelsus, Jakob Böhme, and even an 18th century visionary like Emanuel Swedenborg, informed by some of these Gnostic ideas. So it's so important for understanding Blake, this idea of Gnosticism, that it's useful for me to lay out very briefly the basic Gnostic myth of creation and fall. Now, I'm going to be doing this by gathering from all sorts of disparate Gnostic myths. There is no one unifying Gnostic myth. It's important to know that. But this is the basic gist, and it will help us understand Blake, and it will help us understand Blade Runner as well. So imagine this. In the beginning, there is nothing. There's no space, there's no time, there's no creation. There is simply a presence that is infinite, a presence that is eternal. This is what the Gnostics call God, a power that does not create, a power that does not divide, a power that is beyond space and time. But nonetheless, paradoxically, this deity has thoughts. It emanates out from itself, attempting to know itself fully. So instead of creating matter, this deity might think justice or truth or righteousness. And these thoughts of this deity are known as eons, or emanations. And the deity and all the emanations are known as the pleroma, the fullness. But what happens? At a certain point, one of these eons, usually Sophia, desires to get closer to the deity and therefore comes out of her place in the perfect harmony. She missteps. She overleaps her boundaries. And in doing so, she is blasted back to where she should be by the deity, and in that blast, she becomes impregnated. And she gives birth to a monstrous creature, sometimes called Ealdabaoth. And all the aeons say, oh, this is disgusting, and they throw the monstrous creature out of eternity, and they create for him a kind of muddy pen, let's say. And they throw him there and ignore him. Well, this creature grows up and eventually grows up to say, who am I? Well, I don't know. I'm the only one here. I must be God. And so this creature starts molding out of this mud worlds and planets and stars, and eventually he chooses a planet he likes best, and he thinks, gosh, I'm the ruler of this planet, but I need to be reminded that I'm the ruler of this planet. So he creates two little figures and he makes them work, and knowing that in their work they will remind him that he's the boss. And he puts a tree down there among these two people, and he says, this tree will remind you that I'm in charge. I'm number one. Well, meanwhile, up in the pleroma, poor Sophia feels great remorse over what she has done. She sees her son is being very cruel to these two people. So she decides, with the permission of the pleroma, to go down into this muddy, mucky realm. And she takes on the form of a serpent. And she sits in this tree that is there to remind these poor people that Ealdabaoth is God. And she says to them, come to me. Let me give you some fruit. This is the fruit of knowledge, of gnosis. And they eat from the fruit, and they realize that, oh my gosh, Ealdabaoth is not really God. There's a true God beyond space and time in the pleroma, and we have a spark within us now that connects us to that God. We now know we are now Gnostics. And we now know not to take this world seriously. We now know not to take this God seriously anymore at all. We now know that the best way to transcend this world is not to take the world seriously or to take this God seriously. So you can see this clever rewriting of the book of Genesis where the serpent is now the hero and the creator God is now the villain. So when we look at Blake's work, we'll see over and over again old male figures who are tyrants. And they're very much like Ealdabaoth, or very much how God or Jehovah or Yahweh would appear to Gnostics. He's a villain, he's tyrannical, he's selfish, he's petty. In Blake's case, usually he's on the side of reason. He's called Urizen or Urizen. And we see in contrast various artistic figures, poets, prophets, who are trying to push against Urizen and help those under his sway transcend him. And we'll see this idea show up very quickly in Blade Runner 2 with the figure of Tyrell, who is a tyrant, who is a kind of Ealdabaoth, or Yahweh, or Jehovah, who has built a race of machines who are there to work for him and worship him. And one of the machines, Roy Batty, becomes a Gnostic, as it were. He knows that he is being oppressed, and he also knows that he has powers that are in some ways more human than those of his creator. So this is a very loose and non-scholarly rendering of the basic Gnostic myth, and I think it will help us into Blake as well as into the films connected to Blake.